Hello, my name's John and I'm a storyteller. I love stories. I hope you do as well. And I've got lots of wonderful stories to tell you. I've actually produced a website with all these stories on www.biblestorycards.co.uk. You can see all my stories. I'm also a bit of a painter, and so I paint pictures to help me tell my stories. I hope you enjoy them. Hello, it's John here again with another one of my stories. You ready for it? Do you like these stories? I hope you do. Well, this one is a very special one. It's from the Old Testament and it's about a character that I'm sure you heard of. You might have even seen a film about him, or you might have done a play at school about him, because it's the story of a man called Joseph. Now, Joseph was one of the 10 sons, one of the 12 sons rather, of Jacob. You remember the story of Jacob, don't you? Who had the dream. Well, he had 12 sons in the end, and each one of them became a very famous person. Well, this Joseph one, well, he was a kind of favourite. His father loved him greatly. It's a good thing that he was, because he was a fine fellow, a really good young man. So his father and mother loved him very much. And in order to prove it to his 11 brothers, his father gave him this beautiful coat, all different colours. So wherever he went, everybody would know he's the favourite. He's the one that father loves more than the rest of us. So you can imagine that his brothers were a bit jealous of him. But it was their fault, because they were a bad lot, really. They were always getting into trouble and doing bad things. And once Jacob said to Joseph, "Go and find your brothers. They're looking after the flocks somewhere. Go and see what they're doing and bring back a report for me, because I know what kind of people they are. They're always causing trouble and nuisance. So go and look for them." So he went and travelled a long way, and finally he found where the flocks were, and he found where his brothers were. The night before he met them, he had a dream. And this was the dream he had. He said, "You know, brothers, I had a dream last night, and I dreamt that we were in the field together, and I had a sheaf of corn, and you had a sheaf of corn, and all your sheaves of corn bowed down to my sheaf of corn. What do you think of that then?" "Yeah, you cheeky little monkey, we'll give you your sheaf of corn and our sheaf of corn." And they really were very angry with him for that. Perhaps he was a little bit unwise to give that story, give the account of the dream to them, because it sounded as if he was boasting and saying he was better than them. Well, in fact he was, but perhaps that wasn't his job to say that. So he was hated by his brothers. I put a word down there on each one of these parts of the story, just to try and highlight it. So they hated him. And they hated him so much that they said in the end, "Let's get rid of him. Let's kill him. Look, we could get an animal from the flock, and we could kill it, and we could get the animal's blood and put it on his favoured coat, you know, the coat of many colours, and we could take it back to his father and say, a wild animal has got him. And when we could kill him ourselves and get rid of him. No more of these dreams." Well, one of his brothers, Simeon, said, Don't kill him. That's wrong to do that. Don't kill him. Look, put him in that pit for now till we decide what to do. We'll have a conference about it, we'll have a discussion and we'll decide what to do. And that night, as they were sitting there over their campfire, a group of traders came by. And they were going all the way to Egypt, these traders. And so they had this idea, the brothers had this idea, let's sell him as a slave. And then we'll never see him again if he goes down to Egypt. It's hundreds of miles away. So they pulled him out of the pit and they offered him to these traders as a slave. So they paid for him and off he went the next day with them all the way down to Egypt, probably tied up as a slave. What a miserable thing. How would he deserve that? Anyway, as they went, they eventually got to Egypt. And there was a slave market there where all these people were standing around that had been captured, like, about slave markets, I'm sure. And somebody came up and looked at Joseph and thought, well, he's a fine looking young man. I'll buy him. And he can come and be in my house as my slave. So that's what he did, this man called Potiphar. And he was, in fact, one of the chief servants of the king of the land, the Pharaoh of Egypt. And so he saw that Joseph was so good at working, and everything that he did worked out well. Everything that Joseph took charge of was successful. The fields and his servants and everything. So he made him in charge of his house. And when Potiphar's wife saw Joseph, what a handsome young man he was, and she thought, ooh, I fancy him. I'd like to have him as my own. So when Potiphar was out one day, she slipped into Joseph's room and she started to tempt him to go to bed with her, would you believe? And he said to her, listen, your master has given everything into my hand. He trusts me with everything except for you. How can I sin against God and do this terrible thing? But she grabbed a hold of Joseph's robe, his cloak, and she started shouting, help me, I'm being attacked, I'm being attacked. Well, of course she wasn't being attacked, but so Joseph ran out as quickly as he could. But of course eventually the servants heard her story. Oh, he came in here and tried to attack me. And I shouted for help, which was a big lie, of course. But because he'd done this, because he was accused of doing this anyway, eventually he was put into prison and tied in chains. But there in prison, he met two men. And they belonged to the royal court. They were servants of the king, members there in the royal court. And one of them was the wine taster, and the other one was a baker. And every day, these two people, they would bring wine to the king for him to taste, just to see whether it was poisoned or not. And the other ones would bring bread for the king to eat for his breakfast. And these two men had a dream each while they were in prison. And one of them said, well, they said to Joseph, hey, we had a dream last night. You're good at dreams, aren't you? You can tell dreams. Well, the cupbearer, well, he said, this was my dream. I dreamt that I was at the king's table and I was squeezing grapes into the king's cup for him to drink. And the king did drink, and he thought how good the wine was, and he praised me.
Why, yes.
So the other one said, do you know, I had a dream as well. And he said, I dreamt I was taking a basket full of bread to the king's, for the king's breakfast. And as I was walking along the corridor to the king's palace, some birds swooped down and started to eat the bread out of the basket on my head. Do you know what these dreams mean? They said. Yes, said Joseph, I know what the dreams mean. To the cupbearer he said, there's coming a day when the king will restore you into favour with him, and you will squeeze the wine again for him, and he will enjoy the wine, and you will be put back into his palace to serve him. What about mine? said the baker, thinking that he'd get a good result as well. Said Joseph, I'm sorry, but that dream means that in a few days' time, the king is going to bring you back into the palace, and he is going to execute you for being a bad servant of his and allowing his bread to be eaten by birds. And sure enough, that's what happened. Now, when the cupbearer was just about to leave prison to go back to the palace, Joseph said this to him, listen, when I get to the palace, when you get to the palace, remember me, won't you? Remember that I'm here innocently. I don't deserve to be in prison. Will you speak a good word to the king for me? Yes, I'll do that, said this cupbearer. But then he forgot all about Joseph. And a whole week went by and nothing, and a month went by, and a year went by and nothing. And Joseph waited in prison, waited to be called out, but nothing happened. 2 years went by. Then do you know what happened? Something marvellous. Pharaoh the king had a dream, and he couldn't understand what this dream was all about. Well, it was all about sitting by the riverside, the River Nile, and out of the river came these fat cows, 7 of them. Oh, they were great fat things. And then as Pharaoh was watching the river, suddenly out of the river came 7 skeleton cows, skinny as anything. And would you believe it? They went straight up to the fat cows and ate them. Dreams are like that, aren't they, sometimes? Silly. And then he said, there were 7 ears of corn standing there in the field. And these other 7 ears of corn came up, and they were really thin ears of corn. And they ate the 7 fat ears of corn. What does all this mean? Does anybody understand dreams? And then the cupbearer remembered what had happened to him in prison. And he told Pharaoh. And Pharaoh said, bring him out here. If he can understand my dream, it's maybe a message from God. So Joseph was restored and brought before Pharaoh. And Pharaoh told him his dreams. The dream of the 7 thin ears of corn and the 7 fat ones, the 7 thin cows and the 7 fat ones. And he said to Joseph, you're able to understand dreams, aren't you? No, he said, not me. It's not me. It's God who does it. But God will give me the understanding of those dreams. And sure enough, God gave Joseph the understanding. He said, you know, there's coming a time when there will be 7 years of plenty in the land. Everything will grow, the crops will grow, the animals will grow, and it will be a wonderful time of benefit. And during that time, you really must make sure that everything is collected in and saved, because after those 7 years, there's coming another 7 terrible years of famine where nothing grows and the animals die. And then you are going to need the supplies that you've saved during the 7 plentiful years. What you should do is find somebody to look after all this produce during the 7 rich years, so that when the 7 famine years come, you'll be saved. Why? Pharaoh said, who can we get to do this? Will you do it? He said to Joseph, you do it. You can be second in command and you can do this, and everything that you want, you can have. And everybody will do what you say. Well, here's Joseph, who was put in a pit and then was sold as a slave and then was put into prison. Now he was a second in charge in the whole land. And he was making sure that everyone was provided for. Way, way back in the country where Joseph had been taken from and sold into a slave in Egypt, they were running out of food as well. And so Jacob said to his sons, I hear that there's corn being sold in Egypt. Why don't you go down to Egypt with bags and animals and get me some corn so that we can survive the famine? So he sent all his sons off to Egypt to buy corn in Egypt, to buy corn from their brother Joseph, who they had sold as a slave. And in the fullness of time, eventually, these brothers came into the presence of Joseph. Why, they didn't recognize him because he looked like an Egyptian now. And you know what they did? They were so scared, and they so wanted to buy corn and they find favor with this man who was in charge, that they all bowed down in front of him. That reminds me of something that Joseph said to his brothers. You remember the ears of corn that bowed down, the sheaves of corn that bowed down in front of his sheaf of corn. And here they are doing the very thing that he had predicted that they would do. Well, what was he to do? He could get very angry with them if he wanted. He could have put them all in prison. He knew what they'd done to him. They didn't know who he was because he was speaking in Egyptian by now. And he changed his appearance, you see. But he knew who they were. And you know, there's a lovely, lovely story, a lovely part of the story at the end, where Joseph recognized his brothers, but they didn't recognize him. Joseph had to go out into another room, I think the bathroom, and he just could not help himself. He just burst into tears and he sobbed his heart out. And then he came back out again and he said to his brothers, well, he told them who he was. He said, I am Joseph, your brother. Well, you can imagine how frightened they were, how scared. This man who was in charge of the country was the one that they sold into slavery by taking him out of that pit. And now they were pleading with him for provisions. Well, Joseph said this to them as he forgave them for all that they had done. You meant it for evil, but God meant it for good. God spared me and brought me here and put me into this position to save the whole country and to save you. Now, forgive me saying so, but doesn't that ring a bell to you? Isn't there something else that happened of which we could say that very thing, that you meant it for evil, but God meant it for good? Of course I'm talking about the time when Jesus died. Those human beings that were there then, the rulers, meant it for evil. They meant to kill him and destroy him. But God had a plan all along to save the world through his Son, Jesus Christ, on the cross. Have you been saved yet? Has he done that for you? God meant it for good. And when you believe in Jesus, you can't even imagine the wonderful good that will come into your life through that.